The ever elusive motivation. What is it? How do we get it? How can we keep it? Motivation can be viewed as our desire or our willingness to do something. Although many definitions suggest that it's a force that drives our behavior, I think that after this episode, you're going to think otherwise. While it is lovely and quite helpful when motivation strikes, there are all too many moments for most of us when it simply fails to present itself when we need it the most. I'm here today to help you understand just why that is. And spoiler alert, it's not because of you or some shortcoming or failing of yours. It's not because you're different or lazy or inept. Nope, none of it. Motivation is a fickle fella, and because of the ways that we've been misled to think of it, many of us feel like we are amiss when we can't seem to find motivation to do something we need to do. So, before I say more, let me introduce myself. I'm Ashley McCann, therapist and coach. For over 15 years, I've worked to understand trauma and eating disorders, how our experiences can shape us, and how we can change. This podcast is my way of sharing what I've learned with you to create a free resource to help you on your way through life. And this is In Our Skin. I'm so glad you're here. So tell me, do you feel like you are a motivated person? Are there things that you find easy to motivate yourself to do and things that are harder to get done? Do you have moments when you find yourself willing motivation to show itself? Days when you just don't feel like doing something, so you set it aside for another day, and maybe another day. Is there something that is high desire but also high challenge that you just can't seem to begin or to stick to? It makes sense, and my hope is that by the end of this episode, you'll no longer feel like you need to play the waiting game because you'll understand motivation differently, and I'm going to offer you some things that you can do for yourself to get through those tough, challenging, and less than appealing things on your list, as well as how to begin the things you really do want to begin, but you just can't seem to find the gusto for. When it comes to motivation, we want to consider two types, intrinsic and extrinsic. Intrinsic motivation comes from within. It's the internal kind. It's when you're motivated to do something because it's rewarding, it interests you, intrigues you, excites you, or because it gives you the emotional return, like the joy of accomplishment or pride of doing the hard thing. You know this feeling. It's the pull toward whatever you really want to do today, whether it's to watch TV or eat some food or nail some project you've been working on. You might remember it from something in the past, like the tiny joys that come of making your bed or finally cleaning your room, which you might have accomplished while you were avoiding doing the actual thing you were supposed to do, but you couldn't find the motivation to do. But I digress. More on that shortly. Intrinsic motivation is that internal yes that you feel in response to something on your list, as opposed to extrinsic motivation, which is an external motivator, something like a reward, a trophy, a grade. Or perhaps it's the opposite. It's something that motivates you to avoid a punishment or a consequence. So if there's anyone out there who needs an all too close deadline to get something done, you're not alone, and that's an extrinsic motivator. It could be allowance back in the day that got us to vacuum our room. Or if you're like my best friend, you would just roll the vacuum across the floor to leave the marks on the rug, which actually takes the same amount of effort, but valiant rebellion nonetheless. So extrinsic motivators are the things that we do to receive an award, a treat, an approval, perhaps a grade. It could be seeking likes or followers, and the opposite. It's avoidance motivation. It's trying to avoid a negative consequence like a bad grade or a loss of privilege, maybe negative appraisal at work or amongst your friends. And yet the two are quite the same. They both speak to the natural parts of us that want to go toward reward and avoid punishment. Who doesn't want to maximize a reward? And don't we all want to minimize punishment? Interestingly, intrinsic motivation has 3 times the impact on employee engagement levels versus extrinsic. And external motivators can actually slow learning in school-related research. When we are intrinsically motivated, we're more focused, we're more connected to the task, and we're more likely to stay engaged to keep it front of mind. And that means sustainability. With intrinsic motivation, there's a beginning and an end to the reward or the avoidance of the consequence. So it has this waxing and waning effect on our drive. And that makes sense, doesn't it? It works. It can be powerful one time or in a moment, but it doesn't have that same kind of lasting effect that we're looking for when it comes often to motivation, especially if there's something that we're trying to build on and maintain. So couldn't we all benefit from understanding what pulls us, what compels us toward one thing and not another? How we can find ourselves drawn in one direction and in avoidance of another. Because here's the thing of avoidance. It can inhibit our higher level learning. It causes us to fixate on comfort and relief versus our greater desire or goal. Ultimately, to survive, we need both types of motivation. They both keep us going. They move us forward. Neither of them good nor bad. Yet when we're out of balance, when there's more external reward seeking than internal drive, we can find ourselves with a bit of an impulse control problem. And often this is accompanied by anxiety, depression, and other mental health struggles. And just in case you're thinking you need to reject that external pull toward joy in exchange for some pure perfectionistic, intrinsic drive, I'll say nope. That can also become problematic. Forced drive, determination, can easily look like obsession and compulsion, and those are not helpful or healthy. And we can't stop extrinsic motivations from drawing us entirely anyhow. By the way, I said the word health a moment ago, and I'm all too aware that the way we define this word can lead us to associate it in very different ways from person to person. While I want you to be thinking about your mental, physical, and emotional health, you might use that word in a different way than I do. So let's grab a definition so we can be on the same page. I like this one from the World Health Organization. Health is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely the absence of disease. A complete state of physical, mental, and social well-being. That's not necessarily how we always think of health, right? Health is something that we can use to judge and appraise ourselves, our food, everything that we do, from watching TV to taking a run. But instead, I want you to think about health as anything that can contribute to mental, physical, emotional, social well-being. And sometimes that is watching TV, right? So let's connect the dots on health and motivation. When I talk about health, many, if not most people, start to think about food and exercise. And when it comes to a discussion of motivation, I know that these are things that are likely front of mind that people have questions about. So let's take a look. It's estimated that on average, people make food consumption decisions 220 times a day. 220 times a day? That's a lot of thinking about food. And I can tell you that for the people that I work with, it's increasingly more than the average. So for a lot of people, thoughts about food, thoughts about health are right there at the front of their mind much of the day. Our motivation for our food choices means we have to be motivated to eat something, meaning we have to have that drive, whether intrinsic or extrinsic, to eat a certain way. And that can be tricky. And we're going to talk a lot about why that is today, because we might want to see ourselves eat certain foods. Like maybe we want to eat more fruits and vegetables, but we might continually find ourselves not doing it. And this is the problem of motivation. So let's learn more together. We're predisposed to things for preferences, for convenience, and access to food plays a huge role in how we eat. So our preferences can change based on knowledge and experience. And this could be cultural, it could be interpersonal, and it could be from gaining nutritional knowledge. Do you believe that certain foods are favorable or unfavorable, others that are pleasant or unpleasant? And how challenging do you assess it to be to eat certain foods or certain ways, such as cooking versus getting takeout? And what's it like for you being in the grocery store? How harmful or beneficial do you see eating certain foods? And what are your sensory preferences? What are your beliefs about the nutritional qualities of foods and the health effects of foods? What were you taught about foods, eating, nutrition, cooking? All of these factors are going to play into what you feel motivated to choose and what you don't feel motivated to choose. I don't want you to forget what we discussed in the last episode because a lot of it has to do with what we're talking about today. So if you haven't listened in, you might pause here and listen to that previous episode before going forward. In that last episode, we talked about our initial pull toward food being motivated by an internal drive that's mostly an automated process. It's not from a mindful choice, meaning we're not stopping, thinking, choosing. We're driven towards something. Our stored preferences, and these are based on our brain's appraisal of food, not necessarily based on our knowledge of food. Our stored preferences of food that come from our brain's appraisal of food, not necessarily from our knowledge and education of food, or what are going to compel us in our initial drive towards something. That part of our brain wants the high reward above all. And this is a drive that our ancestors needed to seek food that had a big payoff that could keep them alive longer. For us, we might not be in those types of circumstances, but we might still be driven toward those foods. So high sugar content, something that's going to give us a lot of energy initially to keep us going. But sugar is different in our foods these days, and we talked about that last episode. So we might still be compelled toward those foods. Does not mean that we do not have will, choice, and power over our decision making, but we might feel a motivation towards something even when it's not what we want to be motivated toward. Next, we will lean into our stored beliefs, our experiences, and from our learning. So what do we appraise as the best choice? We don't always actually pause to do this for ourselves. That's part of what we talked about last week and what we're looking at this week. Do we find a food rewarding? And in what way is it rewarding? Is it rewarding in the short term? Is it rewarding for health? What is the benefit? Do we see eating it as a way to avoid a consequence? And what is the expected outcome or the value of the outcome of eating it? That goes back to things like maybe taste or, again, our health. Is it going to lead to us feeling better mentally, physically, and emotionally? So for those who experience food insecurity, a motivation toward high reward foods would make a really great deal of sense. And unfortunately, overeating and food insecurity are both linked to mood and anxiety disorders. We don't all have the same level of access and the same level of privilege when it comes to food and our decision-making around food. We have to keep that in mind. Research finds that emotional motivations tend to trump health motivations in many cases. Knowing that something is good for us isn't necessarily motivating in the same way that our emotional connection to a food would be. And I'm sure you've felt that in your life. Correlations exist between increased intake in the top of the food pyramid and less motivation for eating for health, meaning the more that we're eating those foods at the top of the pyramid, the less likely we are to be motivated for health-based or health-focused eating. And we can look at that in both directions. It's interesting, isn't it? The less we eat a wider variety of foods, the ones that we know might have the most health benefits, the less concerned we are for eating for health. But again, this could be about our life priorities. Perhaps health isn't a primary motivation because other life stressors are taking preference. It can be a privilege to feel able to prioritize health. Yet, research is out there. The mental health benefits of eating a diverse diet do exist. From the improvement of depression to ADHD and anxiety, consuming a nutrient-dense diet, meaning fruits and veggies, whole grains, legumes, unsaturated fats, and unprocessed can impact actually how we feel mentally, physically, and emotionally, and can have an impact even if we have diagnosable depression, ADHD, anxiety, and more. On a weekly basis, 96% of Americans don't reach the minimum for things like greens, beans, and whole grains. And it makes sense. Most of us don't receive a real education around nutrition, how to portion foods, how to prepare foods, and how to consume a wider variety on a budget. The perception that eating healthier is too expensive is truly a barrier for people. The top of the food pyramid foods are highly advertised. They're also highly available, and if we haven't had a lot of exposure to a wider variety of foods, we're going to have preferences for the things that are known to us. Those high sugar foods, the highly processed foods, are also going to be assessed as highly rewarding. Our brain and body might remember that reward that comes of those foods, that initial reward that doesn't necessarily have the same reward for our physical health or our mental health or our emotional health, right? But motivation comes from our relationship to reward. We are motivated toward the things we assess as rewarding. Those rewards that we're assessing can motivate our behavior toward those foods. Having health information doesn't increase motivation for food choices for most people. The exception is when someone has an acute medical condition. Here's where we see the effect of health information having an impact in changing motivation and behavior around food choices, but the effect isn't often long-lasting. Research shows that the more people exercise, the more they feel motivated to eat fruits and vegetables. So that motivation could go either way. Perhaps it's the already in place behavior of exercising that leads to increased motivation to eat fruits and vegetables, or maybe eating fruits and vegetables suggests a higher motivation for health, which then makes exercising easier. It's a classic case of chicken and egg, if you will. Health motivation is tricky. It's not that most people don't want to be healthy. Most of us do. There's another layer to this that's really important to look at. We have to believe that it's possible for us. When we don't believe that something is possible, it's highly unlikely that we will attempt it. The belief that we can motivate, that we can find motivation, or that we can be a motivated person is similar. If we don't see ourselves as motivated, and if we see others as a different type of person who can do those things and accomplish them, but not us, again, we're highly unlikely to try. But very few of us wake up wanting to do unpleasant or boring things. If we appraise eating a certain way or doing movement in our morning or our day to be boring or unpleasant, highly unlikely to want to do it. It's very logical. Those who get up and do things like this, despite maybe having a lacking motivation, are the ones who believe that they can motivate themselves, that they can get there, even if they don't like something initially. This is very important for us all to hear and understand. That belief that we can motivate, or belief that we can do something even when it's hard and get to a place that it feels easier or better, this can build with our efforts. The evidence can reinforce and help us actually attain that motivation. Effort often has to happen in the absence of motivation. Change is hard. Most of the time when we are attempting to change something, we're going against a force within ourselves that wants to stay the same. That part of us needs proof that the change is more beneficial, that it is not of consequence, that it is not going to lead to more suffering than our present state. So even when the present state is not so hot, we have to get that part of us to trust that the change is going to be better than the known discomfort. Our mind and body will stay in known discomfort because it's familiar, and that is associated with safety. Mood and momentary emotion are also highly apt to influence our choices. So I might be highly motivated to do something different tomorrow, but if I wake up tomorrow and I'm feeling low and sluggish and drained, my motivation is going to depend on that moment, not the idea I had the day before to be motivated tomorrow. So keep that in mind. For most, feelings determine actions unless we are really mindfully choosing, meaning that our feelings will drive our behavior if we aren't cognizant of the state of our mind and mood and choosing wisely, acknowledging the directions that our feelings are trying to send us in. We are lucky if we are feeling inspired, excited, and motivated to meet the tasks of the day. But if we aren't, if we're feeling low, despondent, frustrated, disgruntled, our actions may follow those feelings instead. On those days, it would make sense if we didn't get much done, especially if we are waiting to feel motivated. And doing something new and different is going to be even harder than just doing the baseline, right? We've all been here. We can't talk about motivation without acknowledging dopamine. And I shared some about dopamine last week. It's that pleasure chemical that can keep us coming back for more. And it's highly influential in our behavior, our decision-making, and our motivation. And just like some of what we've been talking about here with emotion and reward appraisal, dopamine plays a huge driving role toward our behavioral choices that are rather automated. If we aren't very mindful of it, we can find ourselves getting in these loops of behavior patterns as a result. So let's look at how this plays into it all too. Whether you've heard previous episodes and heard me talk about dopamine, I want you to come here now with a full understanding. This is dubbed by some to be the molecule of more. It's a neurotransmitter that plays a really important role in reward, motivation, behavior. So research early on showed that both in rodents and then later in humans, dopamine was released when we encountered reward. That could be things like food, sex, drugs, social interactions. And all of those things released dopamine in the brain. So this started to suggest that dopamine was a neurochemical linked to feel-good outcomes. But then something interesting was discovered later in the 90s. Scientists realized then that dopamine is actually more closely related to anticipation, expectation, than to reward received on receipt of something pleasurable. So dopamine causes us to want to do something and motivates us toward doing it in anticipation and expectation that that thing will bring us reward. Does that make sense? So rather than dopamine being this neurotransmitter that's released in response to something being rewarding, it's actually being released and motivating us towards something we imagine will reward us. Okay? So let's look a little deeper. Dopamine causes us to want something and to be motivated to go get it. And it's not actually much about the enjoyment of the thing in the moment. That is an important thing to remember. And that is where we're going to be able to develop a bit of a superpower around this. So I don't want you to think that dopamine is bad. It is not. It helped our ancestors by motivating them toward things that they needed to survive, like a joyful boost that would compel them toward food or toward mating to keep our species alive. So we needed it, okay? And we still need it today. What's interesting is that in lab rats, if you deplete dopamine, they stop eating. Like, we still need this neurochemical. It has purpose. So I don't want you to think I'm suggesting that it is bad. I want you to understand what it could be motivating you toward so that you can be mindful of that. So evolutionarily, it gets us to pursue things that are assessed as rewarding or beneficial. And it motivates us to repeat those things because it remembers. We seek out dopamine boosts to feel alive and excited. After we've completed something and the dopamine no longer remains, there sometimes can be like a drop in that joy, a decline, a feeling like letdown. Then, if we have a depleted amount of dopamine, we can actually be left to feel unmotivated, low. While serotonin is the primary neurochemical related to depression, we do see that people with low dopamine can present as depressed. Low dopamine can come with a lack of sleep, depression, ADHD, with chronic alcohol use or substance use. So for dopamine, the goal isn't happiness per se, but it is getting to the thing of reward. So let's look at what this looks like in real life and in action. We're smelling cookies baking in the oven. Dopamine sends us to the kitchen ready to devour those cookies. The ad for the sweater on your computer might release dopamine if you really like that sweater, and dopamine will motivate you to add it to cart. So dopamine motivates us toward what we associate with desire. And there's this thing that happens that we talk about in psychology a lot. Initially said by Ingrid Lowell, who rarely gets credit for it, what fires together wires together. And what this statement means is that what fires in our brain increases the wiring of our neural pathways. So let's say that we are hit with a strong amount of dopamine, we experience a high level of joy in response to a behavior. Those things will wire together. So let's give an example. Let's take the example of winning at a slot machine one time. We are now back at the casino. We have had the experience of pulling that lever and getting a lot of money. And our brain remembers it because that was a highly pleasurable experience. It was associated with a behavior, and now we're back in a familiar environment. And we see the slots. Dopamine dumps. It drives us toward the machine with the possibility of the reward, compelling us to deposit the coin and pull the lever. The unpredictability doesn't actually dissuade dopamine. It can actually increase dopamine. We experience the drive to repeat the behavior, and the repetition of the behavior, that firing together and wiring together of something that's repeated, strengthens that neural pathway in our brain. So both dopamine increases the likelihood that we'll do it again, and repetition increases the likelihood that we will do it again, because this is the foundation of habit formation. Now, we're going to talk about habit formation today in the way that we can really use it to our benefit. But sometimes habits are forming unbeknownst to us. So when dopamine fires, we're likely to develop a habit. We're compelled toward pleasure and reward, and we will be repeatedly compelled towards something that is familiar, that we have access to, or that we're exposed to. Like the smell of the cookies. Not a bad thing. Eat the cookie. Perhaps it's not problematic. But what we want to look at is, where are we getting compelled by this? Because the returns might actually become diminishing. This is the interesting thing to pay attention to. Despite dopamine compelling us toward something to repeat a behavior, it has us do that like it's going to be the best thing ever. Maybe like it was the first time. But that's not always the case. You know, one donut is not equivalent to another. You probably have a preference. And so what this might look like is the smell of a burger joint compelling us to go inside. And if we really pay attention, what we might recognize is the food was actually lackluster in comparison to what we thought it would be. That anticipation and expectation led us there, and that's not bad. But we have to pay attention to what the experience is actually like in the moment. And when we do this, and it's good, we get to tap into some other neurochemicals. When the experience isn't as we'd hoped, we get to log that as new information. And we can start to redirect our attention and even redirect our dopamine when we do this, okay? So while we might be living life a bit on autopilot, we can become a bit more awake, aware, and choose. While dopamine might have us going back for something more and more, trying to get the joy we experienced the first time, we might not ever get that experience again. We can pay attention to this and use it to our benefit. In this way, we want to be mindful of the ways in which dopamine fuels attachment to things, craving, and the way in which it reinforces habit. It's not all that is involved in addiction. And I want to say here that it is not all that is involved in addiction. And people do suggest this a bit too freely, making associations between dopamine leading to addiction with things like screens and foods, etc. It's not actually researched to be true. Okay, so let's take a quick look at addiction for those of you who are curious because I'm talking about this, because it can certainly affect what we're motivated toward. If you have ever heard that sugar is as addictive as cocaine, I want you to know that that was a really unfortunately proliferated piece of misinformation. I want to remind you about what I shared in a recent episode, that sugar becomes increasingly craved when it is restricted. And this was actually the finding of the study that was misinterpreted and spread like wildfire to suggest that sugar is drug-like. Yes, both sugar and drugs elicit the release of dopamine, but the levels are nowhere near comparable, okay? So, a massive amount of dopamine is released in response to drugs, and while dopamine is released in response to sugar, it is not the same. As for social media use, addiction is also not the condition that we see coming out of this repetitive behavior. What we do see correlated with social media use is increased emotional distress and mental health conditions such as depression, but not addiction per se. Interestingly, though not surprisingly, the former vice president of user growth at Facebook was quoted to have said that he feels tremendous guilt. And here's what he was quoted to say. The short-term, dopamine-driven feedback loops that we have created are destroying how society works. I think that says enough. While it's not addiction, it is problematic. Those likes that we get on Instagram, those fast and fun rewards that we get on TikTok, they keep us coming back. Research suggests that on average, people are on social media for about 2.5 hours a day. The numbers tend to look different for teens, which has them showing up at about 5 or 6 hours a day. When you look at this, I just want you to consider how much time you want to spend looking at your feed day to day. It doesn't have to be something that is all or nothing, but we might want to notice what is keeping us coming back. It can take effort, but those cravings can be changed and the motivation toward the scroll managed. One study found that restricting Facebook use translated to less depression, healthier hobbies, and greater productivity. So give it a go. The same can actually be true for playing video games, if anyone has been wondering about this in the back of their mind. The research suggests that only a very small segment of the population actually becomes truly addicted. I believe the number was about 2%. But the dopamine is real. And on the other side of this, what I found interesting was that research also shows a functional way of using this for good. When video games are used by kids as a coping strategy to balance out the stressors of life, notice that mindful framework, gaming can be helpful to kids' mental health. And perhaps I should say people's mental health, because adults like a good game too, don't they? So know that the amount of dopamine that is released in response to video games, even pornography, social media, high-fat, sugar, or processed foods, is sustainably lower than what is released in response to addictive drugs. And though for some video games can cause a greater dopamine release than maybe a board game, it does not mean that the board game stops eliciting dopamine release. I think that that's really important for us to hear. I think that a lot of parents, especially out there, and perhaps we're looking at ourselves in our relationship with our phones, we wonder if we are losing our ability to enjoy other activities. Now, I'll tell you that actually is about our changing attention spans, but that's for another day. So joy can still exist in other places. One last thing on this. You may have heard of dopamine fasting. It was this trend that suggested that abstaining from anything that releases dopamine would be beneficial and necessary, that it could reduce the effect of dopamine in your life. No, dopamine doesn't actually decrease when you avoid certain activities. So this concept was based on a suggestion to reduce social media for a specific period of time, for example, and it was based on a misunderstanding of how dopamine works. If done differently, not all or nothing, something that could be a helpful practice would be to moderate or to work toward habit change. The scientists who studied dopamine would like us all to know that we would not have evolved and we would not have survived as a species without dopamine. But know that we can let that surge of dopamine help us update our expectations. If we start paying attention, that could help us begin to change our behavior. So put this to use. We can start to pay attention to what we actually feel like when we are experiencing the thing that dopamine has been guiding us toward. We can notice how we feel while and after we eat the donut, and we can notice how we feel after 30 minutes or an hour of the scroll. And when we keep losing at that slot machine, we can notice. So now that we've done all of this talk about pleasure, we need to acknowledge the effects of the less pleasurable parts of life on motivation. Because let's face it, there are a lot of things that we would rather not do most days. And dopamine's certainly not compelling us toward those things. So when we don't want to do something, we might be apt to put it off. And here's where procrastination enters the conversation. Research says that most people are procrastinators, and I think you're going to understand why in a moment. Most of us do have the habit of putting things off. Now let's look at what we know about intrinsic and extrinsic motivators. When do we do things? We do things when we feel like it, or when we don't have a choice. We have a deadline. There's a consequence. When we look at what we know about motivation, it makes sense that we don't feel driven to do things that we don't have reason to do right now. If we don't have interest and we don't have an outside force compelling us, then it really makes sense that those things would go to the bottom of our list. Procrastination isn't about laziness. In fact, we often do a lot in the face of this form of avoidance. When we're procrastinating, we're often doing something else. Procrastination isn't a sign of a human who lacks motivation as a person. It's simply that that person who is procrastinating isn't motivated toward that particular task at that particular time. So remember the episode on strategies? Procrastination is a strategy. We're trying to avoid the discomfort or the disinterest of a task. We're trying to avoid boredom, perhaps, and we're trying to avoid failure or imperfection by engaging in something different. So perhaps it's showing us where we're challenge avoidant in favor of something more comfortable or pleasing. So procrastination happens when the interest is lacking, no intrinsic motivator, or when the reward is lacking, or the punishment or consequence doesn't feel yet like enough of a threat to provoke us. In this way, I think that we misuse the word procrastination. It's a bit of a misnomer because it suggests that we're doing something wrong, that it doesn't make sense, when it actually does make complete sense on a psychological level. The use of this word often elicits self-judgment and labeling, and that creates another type of self-reinforcing cycle. It increases anxiety, it lowers self-esteem, and it makes it more likely that we will be less motivated. Because when our mood is lower, we are less motivated. We see this time and time again. So remember, take a look at why you don't want to do something and try to look at it with curiosity rather than judgment, rather than labeling. Because when we label something as procrastination, we're more likely to feel less motivated toward it. It's as simple as that. You're more likely to feel like there's something wrong with you, even when there's not. So please pump the brakes and remember what you're learning here. We need internal drive. We have to have some self-assessed high interest or reward, or an external driving force to get motivation to kick in. That can be a reward or a deadline. But the thing is, we don't always have those things. And so then we need to rely on something different than motivation, which is what we're coming into in a moment. We would all benefit from unlearning that we need to feel like doing something to do it. Seriously, consider how often you find yourself waiting to feel ready, excited, inspired, and motivated to perform or take action. What you aren't interested in today, you're highly unlikely to be interested in tomorrow. What this means is that we are all simply waiting for stress to activate and compel us toward finish lines. That's a pretty accurate description of procrastination, wouldn't you say? Disinterested, uninspired, avoidant, and then it's like a fire alarm going off and we are rushing to save our lives, pounding through a task. Overcoming patterns of avoidance comes down to the realization that in most cases, we have to take action first. If we cling to the idea that we actually need to want to do something and that motivation will show up in order to get it done, we may never begin. What is unfortunate is that this happens most often with things that we really do want for ourselves. And that's what's interesting. If I want it for myself, why isn't the interest high enough for motivation to show up? Because often what we want for ourselves also comes with assessed threat and challenge. If you look back on earlier episodes around stress and strategies, you're going to understand why it makes sense that we get stuck. So for the things that we want for ourselves, it's highly unlikely that we're going to get to that same level of stress, for example, from a deadline, as we would in a situation at work. While work will eventually offer the extrinsic motivator of a consequence, our own interests and desires likely will not. They could be put off for time immemorial. So it's about making choice, making a commitment to ourselves to do it even though it's hard, even when we're unsure of the reward. It's about repeating this choice and repeating the action. It's about habit formation, not about motivation. So I think that you're beginning to see here that much of our behavior change comes from habit and not from motivation. We are likely to be compelled to do the same things over and over again. That's motivation. We are motivated often to do the same things over and over again. The familiar, the easy, the rewarding in the short term, but maybe not the rewarding in the long term. Getting ourselves to motivate for something that will benefit us later but not now is not going to come from motivation. It's going to come from habit. So the challenge is to begin to go toward the things that are in our best interest in the long term and to move away from the things that we are compelled to do that are no longer in our best interest. So if you feel stuck, it makes sense. And if you know better but can't seem to do the harder thing, then you're actually just like most people. But it is possible if we begin to approach change through habit building instead of looking at a lack of change as a motivation problem. Change, if it is truly good for us, is self-reinforcing. But we need to begin to get to that place. When it starts to provide joy, reward, and benefit, that's the stuff of motivation. It follows action. It doesn't come before the action. What the research shows us time and time again is that small, super reasonable changes are most effective. So for example, let's say that you want to start a morning walk routine. First, you might actually have to start by going to bed earlier so that you can wake up in the morning with a little more ease. And then the walks might be easier to get out of bed for. Otherwise, the likelihood of hitting snooze is strong. In that moment, most of us are more motivated towards sleep and the reward of sleep than toward the unknown reward of the walk. So choice is big here. In many situations, motivation is the byproduct of action. In any low-interest, low-reward task, action is the predecessor. And if we're lucky, the motivation will build. Now, I mentioned mood as we've been talking. I wanted to swing back around to give some hope and strategy to those of us who could use a boost. Mood, and depression in particular, does play a large role in our ease or challenge in getting ourselves going. I want to validate that. Some days choosing is harder, and for some people, the struggle is greater. If you're clinically depressed or wonder if you are, check with your therapist. Mood is important for all of us to consider. For those moments when we're feeling low, motivation is significantly less likely to strike. Again, we are better served putting our efforts toward taking steps to improve mood. Do that through habit formation. There are approaches that can help us tap into other types of feel-good chemicals that can benefit us whether we have low mood or not, and I really am excited to talk to you about these today. We've spent a lot of time talking about dopamine, but I want you to know about these other neurochemicals that can help you build new habits and change. We call them the here and nows. While we refer to dopamine as a molecule of more, it will send us lunging toward a predicted pleasure. There are other neurochemicals that help us stay grounded in the present. They are GABA, serotonin, endorphins, and oxytocin. These neurochemicals help us experience satisfaction in the moment without compelling us toward more. GABA, we think of as the anti-anxiety molecule. It slows down the firing of neurons and it creates a sense of calmness. We can increase GABA by practicing things like yoga, meditation, or by tapping into the relaxation response, something that I look forward to sharing with you all. Serotonin, we could think of as a chemical of confidence. Though it does many things, it plays a role in our experience of things like pride, loyalty, and status. So when we feel a sense of accomplishment or recognition from others, we experience the effects of serotonin. That can come from accomplishing a big task like finishing an assignment or producing something or finishing a race. And it can come from hard work. Serotonin gives us strong, positive emotion in the moment. To increase serotonin, we can give ourselves regular challenges and pursue things that reinforce what feels purposeful, meaningful, or like an accomplishment for us. This is where we can go, yes, I did it. So like that example of getting up for those morning walks, when you go to bed at night at an earlier hour, you can thank yourself in the morning for having done so and give yourself that, yes, I did it moment. And when we give ourselves moments like these, we are actually reinforcing our own self-esteem. So self-acknowledgement and gratitude for the things that we've done, patting ourselves on the back is really powerful. The next is endorphins. Now, endorphins are released essentially in response to pain. Moments when we're pushing our body's comfort level, pushing our edge, can bring us into that experience of endorphins. This is a release that you can think of or probably have heard of with the runner's high. Know that you don't have to run a marathon to experience the release of endorphins. You can take a cold hit of water at the end of your shower, try a polar plunge, and some believe that deep belly laughs actually release some of these endorphins. Another option is acupuncture, which has been researched to be shown to release endorphins. So you have some different ways to access this. And the last of the here and nows is oxytocin. This one is affectionately referred to as the hug drug or the hug hormone, and that is because it is released in the brain after physical contact with others, especially those long, extended hugs. Oxytocin is also released in response to our pets, so feel free to tap into them. It's the feeling of love, friendship, connection, and trust. So positive social interactions tend to be the best way to increase the output of this hormone. This can look like things like sharing meals, giving gifts, opening up emotionally, giving attention to someone else, and again, long hugs. So how do we put this all together? What we now hopefully are walking away understanding is that motivation comes from some things in some places at some times, but it is not something we can expect to show up when we need it. We instead have to begin to build habit. We can lean into these neurochemicals to support us in making choice and change that boosts mood and that reinforces behavior so that we can tap into feeling good, but in ways that reinforce the change that we want to see in our lives, the behaviors, the patterns that we want to be able to motivate toward. Remember that if we start with action, we can build and reinforce and find motivation down the road. Once we see that the things that we are doing actually bring reward, we can find that intrinsic motivation within us to continue to maintain that for ourselves. We can begin to reframe, change, and build new expectation for what is rewarding for us in life that can align with our values, our long-term goals, and not just those short-term pleasures that our mind and body do compel us toward. Intrinsic motivation is something that we can strengthen, that all of us are capable of. It is possible. Remembering that, holding on to that truth for ourselves and strengthening it like a muscle is the key. We have to begin to take action and make new choice to reinforce living in the way that we want to live. And we have to do it in small, reasonable steps. We begin by making commitments to ourselves, developing daily practices, those small steps that begin to show the parts of us that are challenge averse that this is beneficial. And let that information build as the habits build. Here's the thing that I want you to know, that the habits that are good for us, that are healthy, meaning mentally, physically, and emotionally beneficial for us, those things become easier over time. We don't feel like we have to keep doing more and more of them to get the good feelings. Instead, the effort decreases. The amount of energy that it takes to do those things decreases over time, versus a lot of those things that dopamine will fire to have us do, versus those things that we go to for short-term reward. Remember how I said that we might find ourselves seeking again and again that reward that we got the first time at the slot machine? When we are starting to make that truly build toward our health and well-being, we don't feel that compulsion to keep doing it with that letdown that follows after. Instead, it's a steady effect. We get more of those here and now neurochemicals that help us stay and feel good about the work we're doing and to keep doing it. So I hope that this served you today in helping you understand your relationship to motivation, the way you've been thinking about it. I hope that you stop using the word procrastination and instead get curious about what's making it challenging to do something so that you can try to approach it in a new way. And I want to thank you so much for listening. This week on the blog, you're going to find a bonus of some more strategies that we can use to build our motivation. So I hope that you find your way over there following the link in the show notes. And there you'll also find the transcripts from our episodes. I am so thankful for you being here listening to In Our Skin. For those who are interested in learning more, check out my program, Change Your Relationship with Food, opening March 1st. If you sign up now, you'll get a 40% discount. If you're interested and want to learn more about my women's circle, Heal, then hop on over to the show notes and click the link for more information. As always, I would love to hear from you, so write me, send your requests, ask your questions. I'm happy to answer them. I really value when people take the time to pause and review this podcast. It helps me keep this free resource going, and it helps more people find it. Until next time, take care.